Alright folks, the time has come to talk about the comparator block. I'm kind of excited to talk about the comparator block because I think it was one of the coolest things added in the 1.5 update. It's probably one of the most valuable blocks in terms of redstone circuitry, at least if you ask me. And what's really makes it cool is that it has a lot of different functionality to it. I've actually got a cheat sheet here. I'm just going to kind of talk about the different modes it's got. Or different purposes it can serve. So it can function as a diode. We'll talk about what all these things are. But it can function as a diode, an inventory contents checker, what I like to call a bleeder, but is referred to as a damper signal, a sustainer, which I call a bleeder with a repeater, and it can also act as a clock. I'm not sure if I mentioned that it also has two different modes. There's a comparative mode and a subtractive mode. And the cool thing about it that allows it to do those things is the fact that it has two separate inputs. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about the comparator block, at least at first, by comparing it side by side with a repeater. So the thing about the comparator block is it actually has a couple extra inputs on it. You'll notice when redstone's placed on either side of it, it points toward the block. Whereas with a repeater, it does not. So just keep that in mind. We're going to talk about that later, I think. I apologize for kind of getting ahead of myself, but I'm gonna do it one more time. The repeater block also has some different functionality when you right-click it, as what happens with the repeater has a couple different settings. This one has a couple different settings as well. So we'll get into those later. I just wanted to point that out first, just so you're aware of it. So the first thing I want to talk about is how the comparator block can be used as a diode, and the repeater can as well. But what is really meant by a diode is that it restricts the flow of the redstone circuit, meaning that both the repeater and the comparator will only allow signal to be transmitted from its input side to its output side. So in the repeater, the input side is here, output is there. The comparator block, same thing. Input side is here, output side is there. So that means that signal is only going to be sent in this direction. So to demonstrate that, we're going to flip both of these levers on, and you'll notice that the signal was allowed to pass straight on through and lit both of those lights. But if I shut these both off and turned on these levers here, which are, I guess, upstream of the of both blocks here, the redstone circuit is not allowed to go the other direction, so it will not light up this section of the circuit. So this is good when you don't want to get bits of redstone circuitry confused and that you only want the redstone circuit to be transmitted in a particular direction. So that's what's meant when it's used as a diode. But at the same time as talking about it as a diode, I want to talk about what happens to the signal strength, and to do that I want to run over to this demo over here. So when the signal is transmitted to a comparator block, the technical term is that the signal strength is preserved, meaning that whatever the signal strength is on this block here when it becomes powered will be the exact same as the signal strength that is transmitted right here. So this block will equal this block in signal strength. This is different behavior from the repeater because what the repeater does is anytime it receives any strength signal, it will transmit a full strength signal on the other end. So really, you can think of signal strength as preserved with the comparator block, but it is not preserved with the repeater. It's always repeated at full strength. But on that note, well, actually, let me just show you that real quick. So we'll light these up, and you'll notice that the repeater, I've built these lamps to go the absolute full length of this signal strength. So this is the full 15 blocks, and the 16th being the lamp itself. But here on the comparator block, this signal is going 15 blocks all the way out to there. But when it reaches the comparator, it's basically at signal strength 9. So you can see that this signal only goes another 9 blocks. But that is also repeated right here after the comparator. So the signal strength is preserved, but again, it is equal here and here. Now that's kind of interesting. When they say that signal strength is preserved, it's not a direct pass-through. Again, it's copying the signal here, or from here to there. So you're kind of basically nudging that signal up 2 blocks. This horse is doing the strangest thing I've ever seen. Hi, how are you? Oh, he likes me. Okay, Um, um, wow, this is the most distracting animal I've ever come across. Uh, at any rate, signal strength is not a direct pass through. It actually is kind of it's copied and pasted on the other end of the comparator. Okay, I think that makes it clear in terms of signal strength. But I also want to talk about the timing of the comparator block. It used to be that the comparator block had no delay, meaning that there was instantaneous transmission from input to output. What that actually allowed people to do was create an instantaneous redstone wire, so that there would be actually no delay from signal on one end and signal on the other end. So it actually meant that within the loaded chunk area, you could send an instantaneous signal. That was kind of cool for some purposes, but it turns out that that wasn't actually ever intended because it can cause some problems within the game itself and cause things to crash. So as it turns out, the comparative block actually has a 100 millisecond or 1 tick delay on it. That's the exact same as a repeater on its default setting. And what I want to do is I want you to watch very carefully when I shut this light on, or when I shut this switch off. The light over there is going to turn off instantaneously, and these two lights are going to turn off at the same time, but 100 milliseconds after I shut it off. So there you go. You can see that there was actually a little bit of delay on those other two turning off after the one over there turned off. So, and that happens when it turns on as well. So there's a slight delay when they turn on, slight delay when they turn off. So the point is in terms of signal timing, the comparator block behaves exactly the same as a repeater on its default settings. There's a 1 tick delay in transmission, and it will continue to send that transmission for 1 tick after it becomes unpowered. Just to reinforce that again, on, off, on, off. Those two both behave the same way. It's just signal power was preserved with the comparator and was not preserved with the repeater. Okay, so the next function of the comparator block I want to talk about is probably the most valuable use of the comparator block, and that's as an inventory contents checker. So the way you do that is you place a comparator block up against any block that acts as a container. So that's chests, trap chests, dispensers, hoppers, droppers. The list goes on and on. Anything you can think of that contains an item, the comparator block will respond to all of those as a container and send an appropriate signal strength. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to slowly dump in some stone into this block. So even if I just put one item in, it starts to send a signal, and it's a very weak signal. If I put in a little bit more stone, not quite there yet. Let's try full stack. No, not quite there. Maybe like a couple stacks. There we go. So as this chest fills up, it starts to send more and more of a signal. The actual calculation for signal strength based off fullness, I'll actually display it in the video right now. The truncate function that you see is actually a rounding function, and it's a particular type of rounding function. What it means is that regardless of decimal value of the end result, it is going to round down to the nearest whole value. For example, even if you get a result that is 14.9999999, the rounded term would end up being 14 rather than 15. So what the equation actually means is that it's going to look at fullness based off of each item slot, and it's going to determine what the max stack can be for the item that's in that item slot. So for example, if I were to take out a full stack of stone and put in an item that doesn't stack, like I'm trying to think of one that doesn't anymore, because like traditionally doors have not stacked, but I believe doors will be allowed to stack in 1.8. But for example, right now, if you were to put a door which doesn't stack into this item slot, it would send a full signal strength because it would say full. And just to prove a point about how serious it is about fullness, if I were to take 63 pieces of stone here and put that in the chest, that still will not send a full signal strength from the comparator block. Okay, so before I get into talking about the different modes of the comparator block, I should point out that there are actually 2 extra inputs on the comparator block. As we said before, so there's a main input here, input A, and then there's an output. But it also has input B on either side. Now, it can't ever respond to more than one input B, and the way it chooses which secondary or comparator input it's going to look at is by signal strength. So the point is, regardless of mode of the comparator block, it doesn't matter which way I have this pin position here, the comparator block is always going to respond to a comparison signal that is stronger. So in other words, it's always going to look at this signal strength in this example and never at that one, because this signal is significantly weaker than this signal is. So just keep that in mind anytime you're using these blocks. The comparison signal will always be the stronger of the two. So what can actually be accomplished with these comparison signals? Well, the comparator block itself has two different modes, as we talked about. It has this pin up mode and pin down mode. When it's in the pin down default mode, that's its default comparator mode, and when the pin is up, it's in its subtractive mode. So first we're going to focus on its comparator mode. What comparator mode means is you have, obviously, input A is the chest here, input B is that torch there at full strength. What happens in this mode is that if signal A increases to equal or exceed signal B, which again is this torch, then signal A will be transmitted by the comparator. So you can see, if we try to dump items into this chest right now, let's try to dump just about everything. It's almost full, but the comparator block is not sending a signal. I'm going to put in 62, and again, you'll notice that it's not quite all the way full, and the comparator block is not sending a signal. That's because the comparator block at this point is waiting for an absolute full signal strength to eventually equal this torch here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more stone here, and there you go. So now it's been allowed to pass through. Signal A is just being transmitted now. So it was waiting to increase or to equal or exceed signal B here. Okay, so what about subtractive mode? Well, subtractive mode behaves a little bit differently. The actual logic there is that when signal A becomes greater than signal B, the signal that is transmitted will be A minus B. So right now we have a full signal coming out on the B side of the comparator block, and we've got a chest here that's completely empty. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fill it up, and we're going to see something kind of interesting here. We get no signal. Now what's happening here is that the comparator block actually it actually isn't being activated. The reason why it actually has to be greater than and not greater than or equal to is because you could think of this as activating right now, and signal strength it's trying to send is 15, but then it's subtracting 15, so you're getting 0. So it actually has to increase to exceed the B signal. Hopefully you're following, but I'm going to try to demonstrate this. I'm going to weaken this signal from 15 to 14. You'll notice it lit up there because now it has no comparison signal, so it's basically behaving the exact same way it would with a comparator block, or the default comparative mode. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this here, and you'll notice now that with input A trying to send a 15 strength signal, that is greater than the comparison signal of 14, because it's 15 here, 14 there. So what we've done now is the comparator block has taken signal A and subtracted signal B from it. So what you get is 15 minus 14 equals 1. So there's your signal. And basically, as I walk this torch down, you will get that same behavior. So now we've got 15, 14, 13, 12. So 15 minus 12 equals 3. 3 signal strength. There you go. And that's subtractive mode. That's all it is. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to talk about before we get away from talking about the comparator block as an inventory contents checker is to show how it can actually work with minecarts, because this isn't actually very obvious. As it turns out, when 1.5 was released, this actually had me fooled for a while until I was able to discover that the behavior of minecarts is actually a little bit different. So you can see right now I've got two comparator blocks, one just sitting against a rail and one sitting against a detector rail. So I'm going to place a minecart on there, and I'm going to put an item in there. I'll actually just put another minecart, and then I'm going to push this minecart over to this rail over here. And you'll notice that nothing happens. This comparator block is not looking at the minecart here. But if I push it over to the detector rail, the comparator block does light up. So what's happening is that the comparator block is actually receiving a signal from the detector rail and not the minecart. But when the minecart with the chest passes over the detector rail is going to send a signal strength based on the amount of contents. Or, well, it's going to send a signal, but when a comparator block is on it, then the comparator block is going to actually look at the contents, the fullness of the chest itself. So again, this could be a situation where you can put a variable signal strength on there. You notice that it's only sending one block here, but if I run over here to where we've got a whole ton of stone, and I dump that into this chest, into this minecart here, you notice it sends a much stronger signal, and this could actually go out a lot further. So that's the only quirk there. You got to remember that if you want to look at the contents of a minecart, then you got to put a detector rail down. This doesn't exactly make me so happy. When it comes to hiding redstone, I kind of like to keep my redstone hidden. So in some applications, I've actually found other ways to not do this, so that I can keep the redstone blocks kind of hidden away from view. This is just sort of personal preference. For most applications, you may not really need to worry about it, but we'll talk about that when we actually get to redstone applications. Okay, so moving on to some of the comparator block's other functions. The comparator block can be used in what's called a damper signal. As I said earlier in the video, I like to refer to this as a bleeder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate it. I want you to look at this guy right over here, and we're just going to watch how it behaves. I'm going to push this button, and you'll watch this signal strength slowly bleed off here. So it powers up and then slowly turns off. So I like to think of it as a bleeder because the signal power bleeds off. It doesn't necessarily just turn off. So what happens initially is that these comparator blocks are sort of placed in a loop. This one's pointed that way, this one's pointed that way, and we've got some redstone to tie them all together. When the button is activated, it's going to send full signal strength here. It won't pass through that way because it's acting as a diode, but it's going to go through this way. So what happens is that the full signal strength of 15 is going to be right here and then copied here. So it'll be 15, 14. And then, when the button turns off, this is basically what's going to happen to signal strength. It'll be 14, 14, 13, 13, 12, 12. So it bleeds off by a signal power of 1 each time. Now, if you want it to bleed off slower, then all you have to do is string a bunch of comparator blocks together and just make it last a lot longer. I'm actually going to break this real quick here. Break a couple of them off and end it right there. So you'll see that this is basically just a longer version of that one. And when I turn this on, it's just going to take a lot longer for this signal to bleed off. Notice that one's already off. And this one's still slowly working down. So what's happened really is that each comparator block is adding 100 milliseconds to the bleed off time. So it goes, say, 15, 14, and then it has to wait 100 milliseconds for each comparator block before it goes 14, 13, and then comes back to 13 over here, and then 12. And an interesting thing happens when you add even more comparators to the point where the button here actually will stop transmitting a signal before it even has time to get back around. So watch how this one behaves. It sends it all the way down to the other end, but then shuts off. So you have this gap in the signal. And I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know what you might want to use it for, but I thought that was interesting behavior. But you'll notice that even this still eventually shuts off. There you go. So again, to compare it to how a repeater would behave, since a repeater repeats full signal strength, if you were to set up a very similar sort of style here, you'll notice you'll get this sort of on-off blinking behavior, but this will continue to go on and off. So this is sort of like a clock, but a very bizarre one. It uses a lot of repeaters. The only way to actually stop this from continually looping is to break the signal in some way, which I've done there. So referring back to minecraftwiki.net, there's another function that the comparator can serve, which is called a sustainer. And as I have described, a sustainer is nothing more than a bleeder with a repeater on it. Again, they refer to the bleeder as a damper signal, but like I said, I like to call it the bleeder because the signal bleeds off slowly. So what I've done here is I've placed a repeater onto my bleeder, and since the repeater doesn't care about signal strength, it's only going to send a signal if it has some redstone signal on its input side. As the bleeder bleeds off, what you're doing is you're actually sustaining the input signal for a lot longer time. That's why it's referred to as a sustainer. So you'll see it in action here. I turn it on, and it slowly bleeds off, but the repeater itself will continue to send a signal as long as the signal is bleeding off. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the comparator block as a clock. So in very similar fashion to some of the other clocks we talked about in previous videos, this basically just has a repeater in it to set the pace of the clock. But what's going to happen here is that I'm going to put an item into this chest, and this comparator block is going to send a signal. And initially, it's not going to have any comparison signal because this piece of redstone is going to be dead. And when it sends a signal, it's going to be at 1 signal strength, but then a repeater is going to amp it up to 15, which will then be 14 and then 13. So what happens is this repeater powers up. The comparator block now will suddenly have a comparison signal that's 13, which is much greater than the amount of signal strength that a chest with just one item would be sending out. So what happens is the comparator block shuts off. When the comparator block shuts off, then its comparison signal shuts off. Once the comparison signal shuts off, then you get your loop. So let's just see it in action here. I'll put a lever in there. And there you go. There's your clock. And again, just like any of the other clocks, you can change the pacing of it with the repeater itself. All right, guys, that's it for redstone comparators. I hope that kind of covers everything that they can be used for. I really think it's a fun block. There are a lot of cool things and applications. But in terms of videos, in terms of redstone videos that I've got coming up, I plan on talking about rails, because I don't think I've really talked about rails too much. I plan on talking about command blocks, and command blocks are pretty complicated. I don't really understand everything there is to know about command blocks, but I can cover the basics there. And then the fun stuff happens. Then we're going to start talking about applications of all these fun redstone bits that I've covered so far. And that's really the purpose of why I wanted to make these videos, because when I start talking about the redstone creations that I can make or have made or whatever that I've modified from other people's versions and things like that, the point is I wanted to have some videos to reference that when people ask questions like, how does that bit work there, because you didn't explain that, and I don't really want to have to explain everything in all my videos. I would like to be able to just point to a couple set of videos for you guys to watch, and that's what these are for. So I hope these have been helpful. If you're interested, like I said, subscribe, check out our server, check out our website, all that fun stuff. We're hoping you enjoy it, because we're going to do it anyways, even if you guys don't. So yeah. Tough. Later, guys.